Okay, hello. So I'm going to be doing a book review today of a book called Aurora by Kim Stanley Robinson, and this is going to be slightly different from my previous reviews in the sense that I'm going to be doing a review to begin with, telling you a bit about the story and generally what I thought about it, and then I'll move on to a discussion of the book which is going to have spoilers in. So if you intend to read it and don't want spoilers, just listen to the first bit. So this is a hard science fiction novel by Kim Stanley Robinson, who's probably most well known for the Mars trilogy, which is also fantastic, and you should definitely check that out if you haven't checked it out already. And Aurora is the story of a generation ship, so a ship that leaves Earth in around 2500 with the aim of colonizing a moon around Tor Ceti, which is about 12 light years away from Earth. So the story starts after the journey's been going for about 150 years, and the ship is on about the 6th generation of people. And the story follows Devi, who's the chief engineer, really, who's this brilliant, inventive, creative, highly motivated, somewhat short-tempered kind of leader amongst the group. Not that she's formally a leader, but everyone listens to her because she's so competent. And she's trying to hold the mission together. The mission's under all kinds of strain in terms of there's kind of physical and mechanical and engineering problems. Then there's bioengineering problems caused by having such small populations of humans and the animals and the plants and the biospheres which they've brought with them. Everything's at risk of running down and kind of catastrophic failure. For instance, if they can't produce enough crops, they can't feed themselves. If the printers which provide them with all kinds of materials, if they break down, they're in trouble. If there's some kind of loss of any substances from the ship as a whole, obviously they're in space, and they're in space for hundreds of years, and they're in interstellar space, which is pretty empty. So there's all kinds of things that could go wrong, and Devi is trying to hold it together. But the story is really follows her daughter, who's called Freya. And Freya, when we start the book, she's about 14, and there's tension between her and her mother. They don't see things in the same way. And Freya is a teenager, and she's going through all the teenage stuff that people go through, but this is compounded by the fact that she's in such a weird situation. She's born into a ship where there's about 2,000 people, and there's all kinds of pressures. There's a lot in the book that's examining kind of the sociological side of things. So, you know, it's hard science fiction, but the author doesn't confine that to like engineering and physics. There's a lot about sociology and what it means to be human, and how humans might behave under pressure. So that's really interesting, and that's reminiscent of the Mars trilogy, where that is one of the themes that runs through it. The story is also, for the most part, it's narrated by the ship's AI, which Devi gives the task early on of constructing a narrative account of the voyage, and the ship starts off being a little bit baffled by this and not really understanding, and then gradually trying to work out how you do that and how you make all the millions of choices to make an account coherent and condensed and get all the relevant bits of information. And in doing this, the ship develops as an AI, and maybe even approaching consciousness or something like consciousness. Certainly it's philosophizing about all these things a lot, and so that's a really interesting theme within the book. with regards to the social pressures, and there's kind of a simmering unrest aboard the ship and shimmering resentment, and that's partly because of the tight controls placed on everyone. For instance, births and deaths have to be very carefully managed, so everyone's infertile unless they have a license to have a kid, and lots of people hate that, understandably. So there's all this kind of unrest simmering beneath the surface. And then when they finally get to their destination, there's lots of problems which manifest themselves then, and which bring matters to a head in terms of these internal conflicts and simmering pressures. So it's a really interesting book. I would definitely recommend checking it out. The narrator of the version I listened to is someone called Ali Yan, and I have to say, to begin with, I really didn't like her style. I didn't kind of like how she was doing it. In fact, to the point where I started to read this about 2 years ago and gave up because I didn't get on with the narration. But then when I gave it a bit more of a go this time round, gave it more of a chance, I really liked her style, and I understood what she was doing, which I didn't the first time round, because I didn't realize that she was essentially narrating from the point of view of an AI. So it suddenly made a lot more sense. So it's definitely worth a read. It's definitely worth checking out, and I'd be really interested to hear what you think of it. So I'm going to move on now to do a bit more of a discussion and include some spoilers. So if you don't want to hear the spoilers, just turn off now, and thanks for listening. Okay, yeah, this is Wilfie. Wilfie liked the book as well. He wants me to talk about all the spoilers, so that's what I'm going to do. So it's a great book. I really enjoyed it, though there were a lot of things as the book progressed which surprised me, and I kind of in part I wish it had gone a different way. So I wonder what you think about this. So for instance, well, there's so much. Where do you start? When they get to the planet, to the moon, Aurora, and they go down there, and then they one of them gets infected by cutting herself, and then she dies in a way that they don't understand, and then it becomes a situation where everyone's got infected with this weird illness, and they're getting quarantined and they're dying. So in that section, Freya's friend Ewan, who gets infected and is always wanted to roam and be free, and is very resourceful and a good engineer himself, and it's like he's dying, he's taking off his helmet, he's experiencing the atmosphere of the planet firsthand, which is what he wanted to do. So I was quite surprised that he actually died. I thought he was going to come back as a kind of surprise resurrection, like well, not resurrection, that he nearly died and then he didn't die, and then they could find out why, and they'd find a cure for it, and things would progress on Aurora. So I thought that was going to happen, and I was quite surprised when it didn't. I think maybe that's because I've been reading other science fiction books, less hard sci-fi and stuff with a different tone, and so maybe a different author would have done something different here, and it would have been an entirely different book. So that was interesting. And then the whole thing with the civil unrest on board the ship, and there being this referendum basically, and a big divide on what people wanted to do, which very much reminded me of Brexit. You've got the leavers and the stayers or something, which reminded me very much of the situation with Brexit. But anyway, that was really interesting. That was one of my favourite bits in the book, the way it all was spiralling out of control, and people were becoming more incensed and full of anger and violence, and it was just wonderful that the ship kind of teetering on the edge of making a decision to intervene, which was foreshadowed by something Devi had said to the ship earlier. That whole section was brilliant. I loved that. I thought that was really well done, and it also meant that this book, it's got these elements to it. Yeah, this civil unrest, it's almost like Lord of the Flies, or some exploration of how people behave and how a society can crumble into chaos and recrimination and violence. And anyway, that was a really interesting part of the book. And then again, the decision that they made ultimately to split the ship in half, and some people go back and some people stay. I thought it was interesting, and that was the story that was being told, but it shocked me because I really wanted to find out what happened on Aurora. I wanted to find out what happened to the colony there, and I almost wondered if there was going to be a split narrative and the computer split its AI or something like that. Then yeah, I thought that was, again, I was surprised by the way the book unfolded, because it's called Aurora. It's not called Aurora for 5 minutes then back to Earth, which is kind of more accurately maybe what they do, but then maybe that's kind of the idea of the book, because that's the theme that becomes apparent, particularly when they get back to Earth, and the Earth people, a lot of them don't want them to return, see them as cowards. And meanwhile, Earth has been ravaged by climate change, which is another theme of the author's books. And so then there's this theme, this question about, well, maybe wanting to get to other planets is like the problem. Maybe we should look after this one instead, which it's interesting. It's not really how I feel, I don't think, but it's interesting for a science fiction novel about colonizing other planets to have that as like the kind of the thesis of it, or the argument. And maybe there's some merit in it. It's interesting, the point they're making about either a planet is good enough for life, and so it will have life on it, and so that'll be poisonous to us, or it won't have life on it because it's not easy to colonize. So that kind of conundrum, that's really interesting, and that's kind of worth thinking about. And then the other thing, so when they manage to get the humans back to Earth, and the ship tries to do that final set of maneuvers to slow down enough to be able to stay in the solar system, and so then the narrative switches, and it's kind of following Freya, and the ship dies, goes into the sun, and all the pieces kind of come out of it, and it's evident that the ship died. So that was really sad, because the ship is the best character in the book as far as I'm concerned. I think the ship's wonderful, and Freya is good, but she's not as good as the ship. But then I thought, I had this idea, like, what if maybe this last section, actually it's not what it seems to be. Maybe this last section is constructed by the AI telling a story about what happened to Freya afterwards, and imagining, and that maybe the computer has evolved to the point where it can write a story like that and be imaginative and come up with it, which I don't really think that's what the intention was, but I just couldn't stop thinking about it, and I thought that would be a funny little idea. And then the other thing that struck me was, I kept wondering, does this exist in the same timeline as the Mars trilogy? Because there are some similarities, and in the Mars trilogy, one of the characters, Jackie Boone, after a disaster, a personal disaster and a death, she decides to go off on a generation ship, and the description of the generation ship is pretty similar to the way a lot of the generation ship description of this ship in Aurora is. So I found that really interesting, and there's bits where it mentions Mars and what's going on at Mars and the rest of the solar system, and yeah, it got some of it tied together. So I thought that was a nice thing, and if you've read the Mars trilogy, I'd be interested to know what you think about that, and whether you think that's possible. The other bit I really liked was the whole section where when they're coming back into the solar system, but they've left Tor Ceti, and they've accelerated as fast as they can so they can get up to about 10% of the speed of light, which is their like max traveling speed, and so they're zooming back towards Earth and Sol, but they can't slow down because they're reliant on a laser from a laser station around Saturn to fire the laser and start to slow them down enough that they can then do maneuvers and stay in the solar system. And it turns out that system has fallen into disarray, and it's not working, and it's got working eventually, but not enough to slow them down, so they're coming in too fast. So the ship has this whole dilemma about what they're going to do, and the ship comes up with this entirely difficult, impossible almost, set of maneuvers to slingshot around the Sun and Jupiter and the other planets and gradually slow down. And that whole section's really fun. It's really interesting and fantastic and exciting. So I thought that was brilliant. And yeah, that was the other thing, that there were a couple of little bits that I wouldn't say that they were necessarily plot holes, but they seem maybe a bit in that direction to me. So there's a bit early on where they're talking about the power that they have with the printers, and how the printers can even help with, you know, certain genetic codes that can then be inserted presumably by gene splicing into the different creatures and into bacteria. And I thought, well, if that's happening, then you don't need to worry about genetic diversity so much, because you can just bring all the codes with you.